The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. Good morning. Welcome from wherever you are in the world, whatever time it might be. Hello. Welcome to our first Topic 1 discussion on our MOOC for Scrum versus Lean. Now, we're going to go through a bit of housekeeping discussion and a bit of an introduction to let you know what's going to happen, what to expect over the next 90 minutes or so that we have planned for this tonight. And we've just put up a poll that I'm hoping some of you might have had a chance to vote in and have a look at. If you did miss it, the results will be included in the beginning of the recording of this webinar. So we are recording tonight, and we're going to go through some of the details about how this is all going to work. Now, thanks for tuning in, everyone. We have plenty of people joined in already, but more logging in as we speak. So we have sort of gone a little bit slow the first couple of minutes. We'll get into it at a gentle pace just to let everyone log in and get their head around what's happening with all of this. Let's first kick off with our session contents and just talk about what we're going to cover tonight and what's going to be in this webinar, what we're going to do. First of all, we will have a bit of a discussion about housekeeping, that is what to do, how to interact with things, how to make it all work. We're going to talk for a little while about the master's program that this is all from. So we're going to let you know what this course, what this subject derives from. We're going to talk a bit about what this MOOC covers, what the topics are. Let you know a little bit about me, introduce myself very briefly, and then we'll go through our Topic 1 discussion, which is briefly outlined here. So we've got about 7 points that we're going to cover, different slides. We're going to talk about some of the different things. Now, hopefully some of you have already had the chance to listen to some of the pre-recorded audio that is normally meant to be a precursor to this discussion tonight. If you haven't, don't worry. It's okay. It's only the first week. That's fine. You can play catch-up and listen to that stuff next week. Now, first, the important stuff, the housekeeping. How's this all going to work? The questions box. Now, in the panel, the control panel for the Citrix webinar, GoToWebinar, you will find one of the options down the bottom will be the questions box. Now, in there, you will be able to type in any question that you have, and you'll be able to see what other people's questions are and what's been responded to. So please use that. Please throw your questions in. Now, in the beginning, I would welcome and encourage administrative questions, background questions. We have the help of James, who will be answering by text as many of the admin questions as he can. And by admin, I mean, how does this work kind of question. So he'll be doing as best as he can with that. That means that if you do get into the questions box, have a look at the other questions that have been asked and see if someone else has already received an answer to something that you were about to ask, rather than repeat the questions, just to keep James focused on the new questions coming through. Obviously, as we get into the content, please do put your questions in about the content. We will cover that as best we can at various points and towards the end. And we have in the past, we've had occasions where we've had a far greater number of questions thrown up than we've been able to attend to during the live webinar. Don't worry, if that happens, we will create a separate standalone recording of those questions being addressed. So in a separate studio recording, I will deal with all those questions and chat about them if we get too many. But hopefully we'll be able to cover most, if not all of them, tonight in our live webinar discussion. You'll get access to everything as we go through this. So the questions that are thrown up that don't get recorded and added as recorded, the slides themselves get recorded, and yes, you will get access to the slides as PDFs on the web portal. Which brings me to talk about the portal. The portal is where you need to log in to get access to everything, all the resources, all the information, everything you're going to need, all the content, bits and pieces, things to think about. It's all accessed via the course portal. So everyone should have their login details for that now. Hopefully most, if not all of you, have been able to log in and have a look at that. It's where you'll find a lot of interesting things, including the forums, which is your go-to place for discussion, questions, anything that you might think of in between the webinars that you want to ask, or anything you want to ask or discuss or mention or suggest to your fellow students. The forum is the place to do it. So obviously if you've got questions that I can answer for you, best place to put them, if not in the webinar, is in the forums so that everyone can see the answer. So that's probably the easiest thing. So do check that from time to time. If not often, then at least check it every week, and I would encourage you to check it prior to the webinar, just in case there's some last-minute announcement or something we need to let you know about. So when you enrolled, you would have used an email address to enroll, and it is that email address that the details for the login to that portal would have been sent to. So if you can't find that, didn't see that, it should have been the same email address that you would have been sent the email to get access to this particular webinar. So it'll be the same address. So hopefully it's not lost in your spam folder, but obviously check there just in case. Now these webinars are recorded. They're then uploaded, usually within a day, to that portal. So you'll be able to access the recording. There'll be a full recording, including the slides. There'll also be an audio-only recording, so you can listen to it on your favorite portable device when you're traveling to and fro or however. There'll also be a YouTube version for anyone who wants to be able to view it streaming. So that'll be another option as well, depending on what platform you're using. So that'll be another way to go. There is also a study guide up there, which is a precursor to chat about the particular topic that we're going to cover each week. That is meant to get your mind thinking about the sorts of things we're going to cover. It'll give you some questions to ponder, some things to think about, and an idea of what this particular topic is going to be all about, which is going to be fairly straightforward, but it's only a brief bit of text, something to have a look at just to get your mind aligned with what's happening. So I did also mention that there were pre-recorded audio on that portal. The pre-recorded audio is the theory. It's the core content of the theory that's been pre-recorded in an audio format, uploaded there. They're only brief. They're only typically around about 15, sometimes 20 minutes each. There's only 3 per topic, so you never got more than an hour to listen to. And you can always listen to them at high speed, if you like, on whatever device you've got. It's meant to be a precursor to the webinar. So if you can, the idea is to have a listen to that prior to tuning into the webinar for best results. But of course, you're always welcome to listen to it afterwards. You can download them, naturally. You can listen to them at a later time, whenever suits you. This is the link. Now, I know this is not something you can copy and paste. I'll ask James to put an answer to somebody to actually copy and paste that link into the questions box somewhere so that you'll be able to copy and paste that into your browser if you're not able to grab it right now. So that's the address. That's where you'll find everything. That's your go-to place to find out what's going on. We will be sending you some emails. You will get automated emails sent to you just before the live webinar, a day before, an hour before, and then again, I think the day later. So, but those are automated. We can send you emails for urgent emergency things, but there is an expectation that you'll be able to log into the portal and find out what you need along the way. The portal is also where the test will be. So yes, I mentioned the T word. There will be a test available at week 5. So a week after the final webinar, there will be a test online accessed via the portal. And that's a test you're going to need to pass in order to get your certificate of completion for this particular course. So that's something to think about, making sure you got access to that, making sure it all works. But it's all done online, and it'll be all multiple choice. So what's this all about? Well, this short course, first of all, let's talk about what's a MOOC. I mean, a MOOC is, technically speaking, a massive online open course. Most of you probably know that. It's delivered without charge. It's meant to be a sample. It's master's degree university content. It's taken directly out of a master's subject, and it's this one, ITE 518, Agile Project Management. So what we're going to cover is an excerpt from that over the next 4 weeks. For some of you who might have already participated in our earlier, more generalized Agile MOOC, you have already had access to some of that content. So this is what it's from, and this particular subject is part of the Master of Project Management and of the Master of Management IT. Now these are master's programs that are run by IT Masters and Charlestown University. So this is where it's all come from. This is the content that's been created. The Agile subject is a new subject. It is being run for the first time this year. So this is all brand new content that's being launched only in next session. So it kicks off only in a couple of weeks. So you're getting a bit of an early look at some of this stuff. Now, I'll just give you a quick overview of what this master's program is all about, because this is what this particular short course is derived from. The Master of Project Management has 7 core subjects, and it has some elective subjects and some industry subjects. A couple of things to take away from this is the idea that there's both industry subjects and university or academic subjects. And you probably notice here that Some of the university subjects are more of the management focus, whereas the industry subjects are more of the core project management expertise focus. So you do get some credits if you have industry certification. There are opportunities for that. Also, one thing I really want to point out here is you don't need to have an undergraduate qualification in order to apply and enroll with this. So this is a master's program where with other forms of recognized prior learning or industry experience, you can enroll in the master's program without needing to have an undergraduate degree or a bachelor's degree. The best way to find that out is to fill out the eligibility form to find out your eligibility, and you do that by going to the IT Masters website listed there. Now, there's also a link in the online portal that will take you to this particular web link that'll tell you all you need to know. So if you have any other questions about what this Masters program or something similar can offer, that's the place to go, that's the thing to look at, and there's also some email addresses and contact numbers there that you can ring and talk to people directly if you have specific questions. Now, we won't be able to cover too many background questions of this subject at the moment. We actually, next week, will have a guest appearance from someone from Charles State University who will be able to add a little bit of insight and background to what CSU is doing with all of this sort of stuff, and hopefully that'll add a little bit of insight and give you some more background to that. Now, this particular course, this short course, what are we going to cover over the next few weeks? Let's set some expectations and let you know. Some of you probably already have a bit of an idea about this. So I'm going to repeat what you might have already seen on the website. Today we're going to go through a bit of an introduction, a bit of an initial discussion about some Agile thoughts and ideas, where Scrum and Lean have come from, what sort of factors have created them. We're going to talk next week in detail about Scrum. So we're going to focus on the specifics of Scrum. We're going to tear it apart, put it back together. We're going to look at the details of exactly how Scrum tends to work. Then, the week after that, we're going to do the same thing with Lean. We're going to go into the detail of what Lean means, what its core principles are, where it's come from, why it does what it does, and tear it apart, put it back together. Then, fourth week, final week, probably the bit you're all really looking forward to, is we're going to then compare them. Now, for those of you who've already got a bit of an idea of what Scrum and Lean are all about, you're probably already thinking, but you can't compare apples with oranges. Well, that's exactly the point. We're not going to be able to say to you, for this given situation, you've got two options available. Generally, no. You're going to find that either one or the other is going to be the better option and the better situation. So the question that comes out of this at the end will be, when might we lean in favour of Scrum or something like Scrum? And when might we lean in favour of Lean? And so this is the point of what we're going to go through over the next 4 weeks. Understanding enough of what these two methodologies do, why they've come about the way they have, what problems they solve, and how they go about solving them. So that when you are presented with situations where you might be contributing to or making a decision about what specific type of Agile methodology or what amalgam of different methodologies might work for you, then hopefully you're going to be armed with all the information and detail and background knowledge that you're going to need to put together a solution that's going to work for you. And we've chosen Scrum and Lean because they're quite different, because they're fundamentally different. They've come from very different origins and very different industries, and they have very different purposes. So this is one of the reasons why we've actually chosen apples and oranges, because we can't really compare them. So it's a little bit of a misnomer there. So hopefully that sort of filled a bit of a gap of what to expect and what's going to happen over the next 4 weeks. Now let me just introduce myself. I was going to try and sneak in a picture of Brad Pitt on the left there, but I'm sure some of you would have twigged to that, so I just thought I'd put the real me. Who is Brenton Burchmore? Well, that's me, obviously. I'm the chap who is going to be conducting this and going through this for you. I'm your course mentor. So what is a course mentor? Well, I'm essentially responsible for delivering and facilitating your journey through this short course over the next few weeks. What that means is that I prepare the pre-recorded audio lectures for you all. I prepare all of the content for these webinars. I didn't invent this stuff, by the way. I'm not the creator of any of these things that we're going to be talking about with Scrum and Lean, etc. What I'm presenting is the information in a particular light, hoping to give you the right information, the right perspective, the right wisdom and knowledge to make the decisions that you need to make about it. So it's how we present this information to you that might be a little bit different, or perhaps even unique compared to what you've seen and what you've heard of before. And hopefully that'll be useful, and that should be a good thing. So the course mentor is someone who is there to facilitate all of that, as also answer any questions that we pick up along the way, facilitate your understanding of everything you need to know. And obviously, as we've already talked about, we've got the questions box to do that and the forums wherever necessary. Course mentor also sets the test at the end because course mentor knows exactly what we've covered. So I'm your go-to guy for anything that you need solved. There are, of course, admin people behind the scenes. I mentioned James already, who's on with us here, who's helping manage a lot of these questions. There is another team of people backing up James with various things behind the scenes. So occasionally, if it's an admin-related question, they might need to help out, and they'll be the people to deal with that. But for content, that's what the course mentor is involved with. What else do I do when I'm not delivering MOOCs? A number of things. I've got a couple of businesses. So I've got a business here in Asia. I'm actually based in Singapore, so yes, I'm broadcasting to you from the sunny side of the equator, where it's hot and wet one day and wet and hot the next, typically. We have two seasons here on the equator, by the way, the rainy season and the very rainy season. Some of you might know that and be familiar with that, but those of you who live in colder climes can marvel at the fact that it's 32 degrees outside right now. So I have a couple of businesses, one based in Asia, dealing with the creation of online e-learning, even game-based learning. We have designed and redesigned a lot of the courses, a lot of the subjects that I've just mentioned a little while ago with the Masters of Project Management. So there's a lot of that we've helped IT Masters grow and develop and build. I've also got a business that I run out of Australia, which deals with digital user experience design. So that is the design element of online and digital content. So how does that relate to Agile? Well, in regards to the creation of any online content, online software, online portals, since 2006, we've done a lot of work sitting directly in between the wonderful people that create these things and the wonderful people that buy them. And we're often translating between two vastly different languages. So over the years, we've encountered many of the challenges, the barriers, the obstacles, the problems for which concepts like Agile have been developed to try and overcome. So we've been involved with these sorts of things for a number of years in dealing with some of the more obscure problems, and our role has been very specifically to try and find answers to these problems. And we've ended up relying on a long list of hybrid versions of different Agile thinking to get these things done. We've even developed some of our own methodologies for creative projects, etc. So how does all this help you? Well, if you have any questions, throw them at me. We'll go through them as best we can. Anything you can think of that you think I might be helping you with, just let us know, and we'll deal with it. Now, I'm just going to pause and see if, before we go on to talk about the content of our discussion, just see if we've been able to pick up any useful or important questions, admin questions that we might be able to cover that James has picked up. So a couple of things here. We'll just sort by this. Let me just ask James. James, do we have any admin questions that we need to cover?
Hi, Brenton. I've got a couple for you here. One is about the PMP PDUs and if they can be earned by doing the course.
Yes. There is a post on the forums about that, which is worth having a look at. But the simple answer is that, in our experience, yes. This is a follow-up from the MOOC that we did a couple of months ago. And everyone that I know of, that attempted to get PDUs from this that was granted. Obviously, you do need to be reasonable with the request, but it's absolutely the kind of thing that the PDUs are meant to cover. So it is a master's level university subject, and they certainly should be able to grant PDUs for your time and effort in doing this. So there's a link on the forums to go to if you have any questions about it. And I've actually asked anyone who's as you go through this process, put your story up about how it worked for you and what you claimed and how it worked on that forum post so that other people can have a look at that. So yes is the answer. Any others?
Just another couple of questions about what do we expect to get out of taking this course, and can I assume that I could take a project management certification test following the course?
This is an excerpt, so it's only going to be able to cover the primarily the analysis between two of the more diverse methodologies used in Agile thinking. So it's hoping to help you or equip you to better answer the question of what kind of methodology might be appropriate for your particular situation and why that's the case. That's the goal and objective with this particular short course. It is going to give you, hopefully, a boost in your knowledge and familiarity with the core principles of Agile along the way, but it's not going to be a repeat of the fundamental Agile MOOC that we did a couple of months ago, which is something that I think there are ways that we can get access to people. If anyone who has not done that particular MOOC, the people who are new to this particular one, let us know, send an email or put a post up. Maybe put a post on the forums and we'll look at how we can get access, how you can get access to that in the future. So we'll look at that, but there is 10 topics in the subject of the Master's Program, and we're only going to cover really 3.5 of them that are pulled out of that. So you're really only covering 1/3 of what might be covered in a particular subject from the Master's Program. So it's certainly not likely to give you enough to sit other exams and get other qualifications outside of what we're going to cover in the assessment at the end of this. Any other admin questions, James?
We'll probably leave it at that just for now. I'll answer any others at the moment by text, so you can get on with the content.
All right.
If that's all right.
Yeah, okay, so look, throw your questions up there as you go. We'll answer them as best we can, or James will put what he can in there, and we'll have a chat about the content we're going to talk about tonight. So I want to kick off with first the idea of talking about what is the nature of empirical projects, empirical situations compared to the unknown. Now, this is a definition. It's not necessarily the definition. It's one that I plucked off the internet, as you do. But what this definition of empirical is saying is that it's derived from observation or experiment. So empirical, we might have heard the phrase an empirical project. It's guided by practical experience and not theory. What does that really mean? Well, it means that we need to gain the information to make good decisions along the way. So this raises the question straight out of that, well, why can't we just plan it all? Why can't we plan everything? Why shouldn't we plan everything? We love planning. All of our favorite goal-setting gurus have told us that, you know, if we don't plan to get where we're going, we should plan to fail. You know, we can't reach an objective unless we plan for it. We've heard a lot of that. We know a lot of that. We believe in a lot of that. And it's real. It's valid. We plan a lot of things that we do in our daily lives. I mean, we plan little things like the shopping list, or at least I plan the shopping list. My wife tends to be a very agile shopper, if you like. So we tend to plan things just innately because we know that a degree of planning is going to help us achieve our outcomes. So why do we want to plan something? Well, we plan typically for control. We plan for the ability to predict. And the reason we plan for prediction, we plan for prediction because investment needs prediction. We need to be able to predict with some degree of reliability what is the result of our investment to justify the investment. It's all well and good to make an effort is fine, but it's the outcomes that really matter. So if we can't predict the outcomes, then why should we make the effort? And this is the loop that we often get stuck in when we are faced with a particular project or a particular set of outcomes that are difficult to plan. Why are they difficult to plan? Well, because if they're empirical in nature, then a lot of what we need to know in order to create a plan is hidden from us. And we're not going to know it until we have done some experimentation and gained some practical experience, because the theory that we would otherwise need to base it on is incomplete or inadequate. So we're not talking about let's throw plan-based project management out the window and replace it with Agile. What we're saying here is that in some situations where the cost of what we don't know is higher than the cost of experimenting until we know, then we should consider Agile methodologies. So immediately we're presenting this as being situational. It's already a case of saying, well, there are some situations that we can say that it's going to be more effective for us to take a different path than the conventional method that we might already be familiar with, and that is try and plan everything up front. Because if we try and plan everything up front, along comes this little beastie called the unknown. And that's where the empirical project or process materializes. Now, creative projects are a great example, and for a lot of people, software projects are a good example. Now, there are some software projects, there are some creative projects where you can clearly articulate exactly what needs to happen every step along the way. But there are a growing number where that's not necessarily the case. And in the situation that I've been in, which some of you may often find yourselves in, where the person who is making the investment, who may be an external client, the one who's actually paying for this, they are often not clear on what's going to work for them or what's going to do their job. And so the process of planning is meant to be a process of clarification for them to say, well, this is what you want. But, you know, how many times have we tried to do that, plan everything up front, and got halfway through it and discovered that the benefactor has said, well, actually, you know, I thought I wanted that back then, but now I don't. Agile principles and Agile project methods are intended to try and deal with that, not at the time, not when the change is happening, but up front with a systemized managed process. Sorry, my tongue's in knots. Managed process for making sure that all of the people working in that process can do it cohesively and collaboratively. Here's a quote to think about. It comes from a Hungarian chap, very clever bloke. In 1937, he won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his discovery of vitamin C, so clearly important. He went on afterwards to do a lot of groundbreaking research in cancer and the role of free radicals in the cause of cancer. It's Albert St. Georgi, and anyone who speaks Hungarian better than me will certainly pronounce that better than me. What he says is the discovery consists of seeing what everyone else has seen, but of thinking what nobody else has thought. The message here and how it applies to what we're talking about is that it's easy to see the facts and it's easy to see situations. It's what we think about it. It's, in business terms, it's the decisions that matter out of this. It's what we do about it and how we respond to the information that we see. In a plan-based methodology, in a plan-based situation, we're trying to do as much of this up front. So if we're comparing a planning process versus an experimenting process, and I use the word experimenting as instead of saying Agile in that sense, because we're trying to break down the concept of what Agile is attempting to accomplish. And it kind of sounds a bit scary to say, well, let's just experiment and see what happens. That's not the kind of experimenting we're talking about here. We're talking about empirical processes. We're talking about the discovery of what we actually need to know to make good decisions. So does plan-based methodologies have a discovery process? Well, yes, they do. Quite often we discover that our plans were wrong. But then what do we do about it? Well, sometimes what we do about it when we have these discoveries, some of the things we might do can be a little bit unhelpful, such as we ignore the discovery because it makes our plan look bad. We've all seen that happen before, right? Sometimes we change the plan to accommodate that discovery if we can. If we haven't got a plan that's too rigid and causes too much upheaval to change to accommodate this discovery. Sometimes we plan for failure. We like to call them contingencies because planning for failure isn't a popular catchphrase in today's business world. But we build the capacity to cope with discovery into our plan, and we hope we've built enough, and we hope we've built the right thing. And if we don't have a crystal ball, then there's risk that we have to deal with along the way. Where does that risk come from? Quite simply, it comes from the fact that we have shunted all of our important decisions right up the front during the ignorant phase. Now, I use the word loosely because its meaning there is that before we start to do things, there might be limitations as to how much we can know. Now, this conversation is probably starting to sound a little bit cyclic. We've already talked about this. This is about saying that when there are highly important, highly valuable pieces of information and knowledge that we're going to learn along the way, that are going to contribute to the best decisions we can make, why don't we accommodate that? Instead of trying to crystal ball everything and have a plan that says, well, we're going to try and predict every possible catastrophe and have a way of dealing with that, why don't we have a methodology that says, well, we're going to deliberately allow the decision to be made later and make use of the best information we'll get out of that decision. And that's what Agile is trying to do. Now, we create plans. When we create plans, they derive from the goals and objectives, the end game, the thing we want at the far end. That's where plans are derived from. Well, so are experiments. What we're talking about here is that experiments, in a puristic sense, experiments, they begin with a theory or a hypothesis or an idea or a vision, and then they go and test. They test the available information to see whether or not that theory, that hypothesis is true. And the experiment evolves as the information comes to light. Now, a plan is often right or wrong because it tries to be right. I mean, we always want our plans to be right. We want them to be complete. We want them to be, well, perfect. But a plan can be wrong. It can be judged, and conveniently sometimes it can be blamed. Experimentation is a little bit different. You can't really blame an experiment because you went into it with the eyes open knowing that, well, we're going to learn something out of this, and this something we're going to learn is going to be necessary, perhaps essential, to us making the good decision to then move forward and conduct the next experiment. And with each experiment, we refine the quality of knowledge and the quality of outcome so that ultimately, at the end of it, we have exactly what we need and not what we thought we need back in the ignorant phase. Again, I use the phrase ignorant phase a little bit loosely because there are some projects, there are some situations which we're all vastly familiar where there is no ignorant phase. We just know everything. You try building a bridge and we know everything, right? We know we can plan every minute calculation when we build a bridge. We don't build a bridge using Agile. Here's another quote from someone who should perhaps require a little less introduction, but it's another Albert. And he said, no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right, but a single experiment can prove me wrong. The message that we take out of this is that it's so easy to find that little piece of failure, that little piece of negative. That's what we have often trained ourselves to do. We train ourselves to worry about that single experiment that proves us wrong, that shows up the weakness, the failure, the issue. The reality is that everything we do, in business or otherwise, is full of it. It's full of negative, it's full of failure, it's full of things, it's full of discovery. It's full of things that we look at in hindsight and think, well, if I'd known, I might have made a different decision. That's life. And the Agile thinking is trying to say, well, let's leverage that. Let's not be fearful of that. Let's not try and squash that. Let's not try and prevent or avoid that. Let's leverage it. Let's use it. Let's have a process that we go through that says, well, we're going to take advantage of this because we can make it work. We can deliver something useful out of it. So plans are just a tool to aid us in achieving results in a simplistic sense. Well, there are other tools, and Agile is adding to the tool sets. But when we have a discovery process, an experimentation, or an Agile mindset, there needs to be structure. And we say there needs to be structure because we don't do these things in isolation. We're generally part of a team, we're part of an environment, we're part of a group, we're part of an organization. And that organization, the structure, needs to be used to generate alignment, to create the possibility of collaboration. It's the language that we use to get everybody on the same page. I mean, we're talking about the investment of multiple different prongs of energy and resource. Not only different people, but whatever other resources those people command. Stakeholders, in a traditional sense. So to have this idea of discovery and experimentation, to leverage the fact that we're saying, okay, well, instead of making all our decisions up front, we're going to make some important decisions as we go, as we learn, we still need a way of making sure that all of the people involved in those decisions are working within the same paradigm. So this is not about saying, well, let's just make it up as we go along. Let's just, like everyone do their own thing. It'll all be one big fun experiment. There are going to be no rules, no requirements, no guidelines, and hopefully we'll get something good at the end. That's not Agile, that's chaos. So the only thing we can call Agile is a process of the discovery of information that we need to make good decisions through a structured method. Now we've got here 4 different core pillars of structure for useful discovery. And again, we're talking about discovery of things that are crucial to our good decisions. We need a vision of the outcomes. What we're talking about here is a vision of the end game, a vision of what we're actually aiming for. And if you're talking about, for example, software, we're talking about what is this software going to do? And I'm not talking about what buttons it'll have on the page and what features will it have. No, I'm talking about what value will it create? What is the vision of the outcome that this thing is going to do? How is it going to improve the lives of those who use it? What's our method for enactment? How are we going to go about doing this? What is our simple things? When do we meet? How do we meet? Who meets? What do we talk about? When do we do work? What work do we do? In what order do we do it? These things need a degree of methodology so that when people work together, they can work together, not work randomly. A third thing we need is a way of gaining alignment and collaboration. What the Agile thinking says is that it's the people that have the good ideas. And the process needs to support those people and those good ideas. The process needs to be able to support the discovery and the value of the discovery, the value of the information that comes out of the discovery, so that we can ensure that it gets used and leveraged into the decision-making process. Otherwise, if we're not able to do that, if we're not able to make sure that everyone is collaborating towards those objectives and goals, then we're not Agile, we're chaotic. And it's in these differences that a lot of ideas, a lot of people that talked about are trying to be Agile are not. Usually there's 2 parts of this process. There's the, let's move aside some of the old requirements and let's bring on some new requirements. Well, hang on. A lot of people seem to forget part 2 of that. They just focus on, let's do away with the old requirements and restrictions, and let's not worry about any new obligations and processes. Well, Agile has a clear concept of the measurement of value, which is the 4th pillar in the structure of discovery. So what we're talking about with the measurement of value is that you've got to have a clear understanding of how you're going to measure what you're creating. If you don't, what you get at the other end may be a waste. It may be ineffective, maybe unreliable, maybe useless. So a core component of the structure of useful discovery is to have a way of measuring the value that you're gaining through this experimental process. Through the process of saying, well, we're going to make our decisions as we go. Is it useful? Are we learning good things? Are we creating good things because we're making on-the-spot decisions? And how do we measure that? And what does that measurement tell us about how we need to do things a little bit different? Now, if we look for a moment at the 2 empirical methods that we've thrown out there to cover, which is the SCRUM and LEAN. Thinking about those 4 pillars, SCRUM is one of the methods. It's a method. It's a methodology that says, well, here's a stab in the dark. Here's a stake in the ground that says, well, here's a way it could be done. And it has some core concepts such as the iteration. Iteration being a process of repetition, repeating steps. So we talked about discovery and say, well, we discover something, let's use it, apply it, do another experiment, see if we can improve upon it. Then look at the answer to that. The iteration uses something called sprints, periods of activity, methods of enactment, how we go about actually working together for outcomes. It's a how we go about it that tells us when we're not going about it well enough. And this is a crucial fundamental element. We have to know when it's not really working the way we expected it to, so we can change it. And the value in the Scrum model is client assessment. And I'm not strictly speaking talking about external clients, although they might be. They might be another organization that's paying you to do this stuff, but it might be internal. Your clients might be some other department or some other component of the organization that is going to be making use of whatever is being created through this process. So the assessment of value is a crucial pillar of the way in which Scrum works, and there's this feedback loop. And all of this will for those of you who aren't yet familiar with it, will make a lot more sense next week when we delve into Scrum in more detail. But let's line it up against Lean. So Lean has a method of enactment. It has a vision of removing what isn't needed. Core principle of Lean. Let's take away what we don't need. Let's remove the waste. What happens when we take away the bumps and we smooth things out? We take away the unnecessary. We get flow, a concept of keeping things moving in the right direction. And we measure our value by being able to see the whole picture. Value doesn't come from looking at one minute incremental piece of the puzzle. It doesn't come from measuring and looking at saying, well, isn't this great feature? See this button here, if you click this, funny things happen, and that's great. That's a feature. We like that. What's the value of that? Well, we can't really assess the value of that until we look at the big picture and we see that when we do this, this, and this all works much better. There's your value. So different ways of going about it. Very different concepts, but still supporting the pillars in the structure, which I'll go back a slide. These 4 pillars of structure. A vision of the end game, something to aim for, a way of getting there, a process of getting everyone working collaboratively together, and a way of checking to see whether or not it's working. So if we have all of this, how do we know which way to go? Now, before we ask that question, I want to check with James and just see if we've got any interesting questions that have come out of the content that are worth covering at the moment.
Hey Brenton, we had a couple of content questions probably about 15 minutes ago. I'm not sure if they'd still be, if you want to still answer them now or at the end, but I'll just put them to you. Okay. One was, how can you put a cost or price on what you don't know? Which,
well, I think this is a good point, because a lot of the time when we look at trying to compare what methodology we're going to be using, the cost, I mean, we talked about at the very beginning, the investment. How can you invest in something when you don't know what it's going to give you? And how can you invest in something when you don't know what it's going to cost? Well, the cost comes from the budget, a control variable. You can turn around and say, well, on a plan-based method, we say, this is what we need. How much is it going to cost us? And then a whole bunch of work is done to determine how much it's going to cost. And then a decision is made of saying, well, that's too expensive. We're not going to do that. Or yes, we'll do that. That looks all right. And then what tends to happen? We discover that there were weaknesses, errors, perhaps failures in the costing process that says, well, actually, it's going to cost you more than that. So there's two sides to answering this question. The first part of it is to say, well, how do we fix that with Agile? I'm getting to that. The first part of the question, though, the other part of the question is to say, well, what do we do with traditional plan-based methods? Well, we deal with it later. And sometimes that's someone else's problem, which is kind of convenient. But we kind of know that there's a chance that we'll have a weakness or an error in our cost calculations. But we're strangely accepting of that concept. I mean, we don't like it, and yes, there's often consequences, and it's often painful and all that. But you know, we know it happens, and we know that's just part of the landscape of this process. So what do we do with that? What if you knew with a crystal ball that it was going to be a wrong cost? What if you could know? So going back to the real cause of the question, how do we handle that in an Agile scenario? We do it the other way around. We turn around and say, well, you want to build this thing, that's great, but how much money have you got? Well, this is our budget. If we could do it for this, then we'd be happy. We'd be satisfied with that. Well, okay, the variable then becomes the result. The variable is the value. So first of all, yes, you have that same conceptual assessment that says, can we build that for this budget? Well, yeah, we think we can, but you know, we know that halfway through they're going to change their mind and they're going to want something different, and they're going to think, oh no, but we don't want the budget to blow out, we just want to change our minds. So we have a methodology that says, let's build it incrementally. Let's learn everything we can learn as we go. Let's make sure that we're checking for the creation of value every step along the way. And let's be in a position to respond and adapt when the client says, well, we're going to ask for something a little bit different now. and we're hoping you can still do that within budget. Well, of course we can do that within budget, but this other thing that you also wanted, we can't do that as well. So we can change that, right? We can not give you this other thing, but give you this that well, that's fine, says the client. Yeah, I've changed my mind. I don't want that other thing anymore. Can we do that with Agile? Yes, we can. And that's the process point that we're talking about here. The cost can become the strict control variable, and the outcome can be the more malleable variable in that situation. Now, hopefully that does go some way to answering the question on that. I'm just seeing a couple of other questions here that I'll just jump in on and have a look at. Question here, what would you say change management is part of what you call the key of discovery? Change management is very much part of and yet separate to the whole idea we're talking about. I say very much part of because you can't really have project management without change management. There's really no such thing. I mean, no projects happen without actually causing change and upheaval to somebody. And there does need to be, and in my experience, change management, if you look at it as a slightly separate concept to project management, is typically grossly underdone in nearly all industries, in nearly all sectors, in my view. And the way I define the difference between change management and project management is about bringing something into being, and change management is about leveraging it. Now, with Agile, you wrap the two together a lot more than you do with traditional plan-based projects. Plan-based projects, it's a lot easier to turn around and say, well, now, we've built Rome. Where are the Romans? Nobody told the Romans that we were building Rome. Why aren't they here? It's a lot easier to have happen in plan-based because you can have the plan-based project management component without necessarily enough investment in how we're going to make this leveraged. Whereas with Agile concepts, with the discovery idea of saying, well, what do we need to learn? What have we learned? How are we leveraging that learning and that knowledge? How is that feeding back to the value that we've created so far and the value that we're planning to create next? And that feedback loop means that we find it a lot harder to step away from the change management of leveraging what we're creating because we're constantly testing the accumulated value of what we're building. So I would say that it's greatly intertwined, the discovery of knowledge and the process of change management, if you accept my definition that change management is primarily about leveraging what you build. So if that's something, if I can elaborate on a slightly different question, throw up for your elaboration and we'll cover that. So question, so why is the verse between Scrum and Lean and not the combination of these two? Excellent question, Nicholas. That is exactly where we're headed. And you've kind of pulled it out of the hat here a bit early in week one. But yes, what we're going to hopefully reveal, and I was trying to keep it a bit of a secret, but obviously not anymore. What you're going to get at the end of this, hopefully, is an awareness or maybe even for some a revelation that they're not mutually exclusive. And there's no such thing as a methodology. There's just what you choose to use. And yeah, you'll find that there's going to be times and situations where you'll take a little bit of Scrum and a little bit of Lean and a little bit of something else and whatever, and you'll put it all together and that'll be yours, your method, and it'll suit exactly what you're doing. And if, for those of you who've already had a chance to listen to the pre-recorded audio stuff, some of that will make a little bit more sense already because I've already there talked a little bit about these two things. Your question is allowing me to segue neatly into that, which is awesome. Situation and objective. Now, if you have listened to the pre-recorded, you'd note that we have discussed this a little bit already. I'm going to delve into it a little bit more detail here because it's really worth it. What do I mean by situation? It's the influencing factors on our energy, energy being anything that we invest, and its application to the problem, how we invest our energy and apply it to the problem. It's everything. Everything is relevant in the situation. And, to throw in some examples, we're talking about the budget, we're talking about the skill sets, we're talking about the stakeholders, we're talking about the expectations, we're talking about the economic climate, the culture of the business. Everything is a relevant factor in our situation. And the other big thing is, of course, the objective. What are we trying to achieve? The final goal, the outcome, the desired value that we seek. Now, what we're going to look at in the next 2 weeks, when we look at Scrum, I'm not just going to tell you this is how Scrum works. I'm going to hopefully delve into for you why Scrum was created the way it was. What of these situational and objective factors was it actually built to solve? And then we're going to do the same thing with Lean. So at the end of these two analyses, you'll be able to look back and say, well, if this is my situation, and hopefully have a bit more familiarity with how you measure that situation and what you take into account. Well, given that, and given what these other methodologies have been able to do with other situations, what parallels do I find? And the same thing with my objective. If I have this situation, this objective, what do I need? And borrow a little bit from this and a little bit from that, because that's exactly what Agile is all about. It's about what works. It's about picking and choosing. It's about learning as you go and taking what is specifically. It's about being agile. It's about being responsive. And the definition we talk about with Agile is responsiveness. The ability to respond. To respond to what? Respond to our situation and respond to our planned objectives. And not just once, not just up front, not just turn around and say, well, we're going to use this method and we're going to achieve this great thing with it. And away we go. No, we're going to test that periodically. And we're going to ask ourselves, are we still using the right method here? Should we do things a little bit differently this week? I mean, how many project management methodologies out there are going to be able to turn around and say, well, with a plan-based, we're going to change how we do it. You know, I'm going to use PMI to begin with, but if that doesn't work, we might switch to Prince 2. Not so easy. What Agile is essentially saying is that that's an inherent function of how some projects should work. Again, I put that caveat in there. It doesn't apply to everyone in every situation. And it's about being able to recognize not only when should we be agile, but how should we be, what kind of agile in this given situation. That is the core function of agility, making that right specific decision and doing it again at each review step along the way, so that you're constantly tweaking and fine-tuning, not just what you're building, not just what you're spitting out the other end, but you're also fine-tuning how you go about it. And what this gives you is the opportunity to be on the money every step of the way as best you can. And only a agile, a responsive methodology that is built in a way that allows you to make those sorts of adaptive changes, only that sort of system can get the most out of that. Because if you think about trying to achieve that with a traditional plan-based methodology, you're in contingency hell. You're trying to create and crystal ball every possible thing that you might learn and then have some sort of plan for that. And then when that happens, it's all like, let's execute plan 412B because we're ready for this. Well, clearly there's horses for courses, and this is what this is really all about. So another question, someone is saying, Scrum is like discovering something as we go. Isn't it much harder to target a specific deadline? I'd throw this back into the discussion we just had about budget. You can make deadline a control variable. You can say, well, you know, it's got to be done by Christmas. You've still got a variable to play with, and that is the outcome. Because that's where the uncertainties lie. You could turn around and say, I need a great piece of software that's going to make people's lives great and it's going to do these things for them. That's cool. How much money you got? Here's my money and here's my deadline. Okay, well, we can work with that. And what's going to be the variable? Well, what you get. What you get for that money by that deadline is going to be the variable. Now, immediately, some of you are running around screaming with your hair on fire saying, you can't do that. We've got to know what we're going to get. Well, that's why we talk about it every week, every month, every cycle, every iteration. That's why we have the feedback loop, to make sure that every bit of effort we work on is working towards the best result we can get. Now, guess what? You get to the end of that deadline, you get to the end of your budget, and you've done everything studiously along the way, and you've got something of value that was the best you could get with that money and with that time. And if you aimed for a pie in the sky and you wanted to achieve something that at the end of it you realized was impossible, well, if you'd used another method, you'd be in the same situation. Actually, you'd probably be in a worse situation because you wouldn't have been able to get a fine-tuning process happening every iteration. You would have just got a white elephant at the end and an apology. So the idea of saying how do you deal with a deadline, well, the deadline still works. What the variable is the definition of what it's going to look like. But what is less variable is the degree of value that it's going to give. Now, it might not have been the exact piece of awesome software that we all envisaged, when we were sitting around having our coffee and chatting about it at the very beginning. But it might be just the right piece of software to do the job that we now know it needs to do. So, yeah, the deadline's important, but we've made the deadline far more effective for us because we've been able to deliver the best degree of value and outcome within it that we can achieve. Now, I've got another question that's popped in here, and I'll just answer this one, and then we'll move on to the next couple of slides that we've got to cover. We can cover more questions at the end if anyone wants to. So question here I'm just looking at, is there evidence that the application of Agile methodologies to software projects resulted in higher performing projects? So that is, within budget, on time, delivered the anticipated value proposition, etc., reduced value rate. So to answer that question, Colin, yes, there are plenty of studies that have said good things. Actually, I'm going to put up on the portal, I'll put up some surveys and some results of surveys that some of you who did the previous thing might find familiar. But there are plenty of resources out there that you can find that says Agile has improved things. But for every one of those, you'll probably find something out there that says, no, Agile made it worse. And therein lies the secret. So the simple answer to the question is yes, you're going to find plenty of people saying that they have been able to kick their goals bigger, further, better using Agile methods. And then you're going to find other people that said that they tried it and it failed miserably. Well, typically the difference will be how they went about it, how they embraced Agile. And this is the kicker. If you use Agile to embrace Agile, you're probably going to be okay. But if you don't, then you're probably in for some pain. And that's been, in my experience, if you don't change the mindset before you change the methodology, then you're pushing it uphill. And this is why we try to talk about these things first at a really core, fundamental philosophical level. Because we're trying to say, look, let's look at the mindset element before we look at the methodology element and work from there. So some great questions already, folks. Do keep them coming. If you've got any more, we will tackle them at the end. I'm going to go through the last couple of slides we've got to talk about, and that will leave us a bit more time to talk about these sorts of things, and plus any other admin questions that James might have found in the meantime. So if we're trying to decide which way to go, and we know that they are fundamentally driven by the combination of our situation and our objectives. So what does that mean? Is Scrum, Lean, Agile, are they tools? Is it a mindset? Should it be thought of as a policy or a methodology? What is it really? We talk about Agile as being a core principle or a set of core principles. And if you have a look at the Agile manifesto, you'll see that the wording of how it's defined is very broad, it's very conceptual, it's very fundamental in nature, and it's a bit like a core belief. And this means that these principles are really too fundamental in nature to actually do anything, and they're not meant to. Agile as concept is not meant to accomplish anything. It's meant to change the way you think so that you can accomplish something with a different way of thinking. So they're merely a guide on how to think, but not how to act. That's the Agile principles. So they rely on the power of our thinking to enable us to decide how we each must act. So Scrum and Lean are then subsets of this that fulfill a role at the next layer down. So here we start to look at ideas that help us decide how to act. Because if Agile is saying, well, this is how we could think, and Scrum says, and this is how you can do, and Lean says the same thing, this is how you can act, this is how you can behave. They are subsets that are using and adhering to the core principles of Agile. And if you look, when we see over the next couple of weeks how different Scrum and Lean are in terms of ways to act and things to do, if you see how different they are, and then what are the unifying forces between them, how do they actually tie together? And we see that, well, clearly, to tie these two highly disparate methods together, the core principles must be very high level, and they are. But we must try to master those core principles and understand them first to then truly make use of either Scrum or Lean. And this is where, in my experience, implementations or attempts to use things like Scrum and Lean have failed, because the core principles of Agile have been undercooked. And people have gone forward with an idea of thinking that they're just replacing one methodology of plan-based PMI, Prince2, whatever, with this new fandangled methodology. And they follow it like a script, and it goes horribly wrong. Why? Because in order to be flexible, you have to understand the core principles, because you're never going to find a situation where the written process is going to help you out. It's actually the opposite of that. It's a way of saying, well, we know the written process, the step-by-step join the dots, isn't going to help us here. That's not what we're here for. We need to learn as we go, and we're going to have to make clever decisions as we go. So we need a guiding principle in order to apply a kind of thinking or a logic to what we're doing so that we can make good decisions ourselves as people, as humans. So what does this imply? That really humans are more important than process. And that's not just a little bit. Humans are vastly more important than process in the Agile principles, whether it be Scrum or Lean or anything like it. So because these get their power from what we also refer to as a belief structure, they do need a bit of work. And they're not a set of commandments on clay tablets. Thou shalt. Thou shalt do it this way, thou shalt do it that way. These are really examples of how the application of the core principles of Agile have been applied for somebody, for a given situation and a given set of objectives, and how it worked for them, or in some cases didn't work. So when you look at learning about Scrum and learning about Lean, some of the very useful things you can do is actually look at the case studies, and you look at the ones where they said it went horribly wrong, and you look at the ones where it went swimmingly well, and each of those is going to tell you a great deal of what could well be useful information in how you might apply either one or something different. Because that's the core principle of Agile. Get the understanding of the fundamentals. So these sit on this boundary between ideas and action, between the mindset and the method, and they're a little bit of each. So when you see the method and they say, oh, yeah, but this is flexible, you could do it this way, but you could, and a lot of people who are used to joining the dots can get a little uncomfortable with this idea that the methodology is flexible. What do you mean the procedure can be changed? Well, it doesn't get changed on the fly. It gets changed at specific review points and with the appropriate input of the affected parties. So it still gets done, it still evolves in a structured way that allows us to ensure, as we've mentioned before, that whatever we're doing, we're yielding value. And here I'm not just talking about the value of what gets created with the particular project. I'm talking about the value that we get from the methodology. How valuable is our methodology? Well, that's something that needs to be tested as part of the review process. But one of the reasons that these methodologies exist is because when you look at the core principles of Agile, and we talked about them already as being very high level and very sort of philosophical in nature, that makes them somewhat personal in their interpretation. It's so core to the fundamentals of higher thought that they become highly prone to individuality in the belief and the adoption and the interpretation of these principles. And so because of that individuality, this uniqueness of subjectivity that can occur with each person adopting and identifying differently, or slightly differently at least, with the core principles of Agile, we need a way of tying people together into a common theme of, well, that's great, you've all got your own ideas, but this is how we're planning to work together. This is how we, as a team, are going to leverage these principles and these methods in order to achieve cohesion and collaboration. And this is part of the role that these things do. It's the common ground. It's building that common understanding and that commonality for the purposes of collaboration. So we use things like Scrum and Lean to build alignment and to build that commonality in our understanding. And we do that by translating it into saying, well, this is the philosophy, but this is how we do it. And because we have the philosophy, we're prepared to have a chat about how we might do it differently. And we're okay with that because we're agile. So these Scrum and Lean, they act as interpretations, which means, like any interpretation, it's always circumstantial. It's always unique to the specifics of whatever is being interpreted, which means it's unique, as we've discussed, it's unique to the situation. It's unique to the objectives. Unique being the operative word. It's different. You know, you look at these case studies that are out there and you see this plethora of discussions where people have said, well, we tried so-and-so Scrum method and that didn't kind of work for us because we had this little unique thing happening in our organization and, you know, we were floundering and then some guru came along and said, well, why don't you ditch that and use this little thing from something else? And suddenly, hallelujah, it's all great. I mean, you can find lots of those sorts of stories. So the idea is, let's start with that attitude. Let's start with that thinking. Let's start with that intent and see if we can't build something right the first time. That something being, well, it's whatever we need right now, right here in all of this. So the purpose of a method is just to bring commonality and meaning to what we're actually going to do. So when we're trying to decide what we need for us, we need to think in terms of, well, what do we need it to do? Well, we need it to bring commonality. We just need to get everyone on the same page, working in the same way. We need to synchronize the philosophy. And for some people, that's going to happen in a fairly intellectual and altruistic way where they're going to say, yeah, I get this, and I get it, and I can see how this is applying. And then you're going to have other people that are perhaps less quick to pick up on all these nuances and the philosophies and the concepts. And they're just going to need a set of dots to join. And maybe other people will be lining these dots up before them, and maybe next month the dots will look a bit different. And that is a way for those people who prefer to just work within the dots to still function as a member of the team. Yes, they may not be the members of the team that are coming up with the bold, crazy new ideas, but at least they're able to continue delivering their value in a way that doesn't shut them out or make it too confronting or difficult for them. So this is very useful when you're looking at changing a team's methodology from one to another, because you're going to have people adopted at different rates and some not at all. So Scrum and Agile, they have tools within them. They're still a toolkit. When you start to break down, for example, the concept of the iteration, if you look at Scrum as a creation process and the concept of the iteration where we say, well, let's do this and look back and do it again and look back. And that concept as a core concept, very valuable for many kinds of projects. Then you look at Lean. Where did Lean come from? It came from manufacturing. Came from Toyota. How to make a manufacturing process with less wastage. That's where it originated. That doesn't use an iteration in the same way, because you're not building something with a let's try this and let's have another look at it. No, you're building a car, and you kind of know what that car is going to look like at the other end. But what you don't know is where you're wasting all your time. Where you're wasting things. Where are you doing things that you don't need to do, that you thought you needed to do? Yeah, you have a plan, but how are you able to evolve that plan to make it more efficient? So different concepts that you can pluck out of the different methodologies that work a bit differently. You look at extreme programming, and you know this topic is, this course isn't about extreme programming. Let's throw something from extreme programming. Extreme programming has got things in it that allow you to capture some of the important elements that are unique to the information gathering required of certain kinds of software programming. Because programming is not like writing a short story. You know, it's not entirely a work of art. Here's one more quote that I'll throw in. And I've given two names here because the quote actually came from Father John Culkin. He's the guy that actually was quoted or actually said this. But the idea was from Marshall McLuhan, who was a good friend of Father John. And it's very much of Marshall McLuhan's thinking. But he never actually said these words, which is why they've both been credited. But what it says here is that we become what we behold. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. So what do we mean by that? What's the point? Well, we operate in this balance between order and chaos in the business world. We're sort of poised between the changes that we effect and the changes that we endure. And as people, as human beings in the business workplace, we are constantly doing this juggling act. We're doing both. We're trying to change things around us. We're trying to change what happens. And we're also having it change us. And sometimes it's a bit more of one and less of the other. So how many of us have felt that moment when we gave in to change? When we elected to change ourselves to fit into something because that was easier than trying to change what we were being squished into. We know that feeling. We know that scenario. That is the battle. And so much of our world is ruled by process. And as a result, so much of our value is judged by the expectation that is attached to that process. And that's what process is there to do. It's there to say, well, we have this expectation, so we're going to put this process in that means that every time this process gets acted upon, the expectation is met. And humans and machines, they're just things that work within this dumbed-down process to minimize the degree of risk that someone might do something human and come out with something different. Now, we want our expectations met. And that's a large part of the world we live in. And this is one of the reasons why Agile has been a relatively recent phenomenon, and one of the reasons why it's still, for many people, not yet there. So Agile thinking is in conflict with a lot of these things that we've just talked about. Agile tries to find its own path to success. So Agile kind of says, well, we shape our tools, and then our tools shape our discovery. They shape what we do. They don't shape us, but they shape what we learn. We use the tools to learn things. And what we learn is then what shapes us. We don't give up on what we're learning in order to fit in with the process. So it's that difference in approach and concept. Now, you've heard the saying, I'm sure many of you have heard the saying, if you can't change the people, well, then you have to change the people. And the idea there being that, when you need to change the way people think and you can't, well, then you get rid of them and change that person for someone who will think the way you want them to. That's a very authoritarian approach. And some would say old-fashioned, and yet in some cases it's appropriate. But it's an approach that says that process is a tool to force humans to meet expectations. And if you can't change them to do that, you get rid of them. That's the meaning behind that concept. Now, I prefer the view that if you want to change the people, you start with yourself. Change how you view what is going on, and through that change, discover and learn what needs to happen, what the process is trying to do or not trying to do, and how the process needs to be flexible in order to achieve that. So can we be shaped by Agile? I mean, we've already talked about the fact that we are often ruled by process and often in a negative way. Can that happen with Agile? Well, intrinsically it is meant to not happen if Agile is implemented correctly, because Agile is in its core saying, well, we're going to adapt. We're going to respond. We're going to review. We're going to be responsive. We're going to be Agile. So requires this honesty factor that says, well, we're going to acknowledge what the reality is, and we're going to deliberately create for ourselves a mechanism to improve upon it. We're not simply going to blame the plan. So uncertainty, the unknown, it's a fundamental part of what we deal with all of the time. And we sometimes fool ourselves into thinking that we've got the unknown under control because we've got a plan. Well, the unknown is still unknown. And it's still going to have its presence and its effect felt. What remains to be seen is how do we respond to that? How do we deal with it? How do we react? And many philosophies, in business especially, have invested a great deal of energy in defeating the unknown, trying to squash it, trying to minimize it, trying to protect and preserve our expectations with the admonishment of the unknown. And in some cases, in some situations, that is appropriate. But what happens when it's not? What else have we got? What other options do we have? And this is this gap, this acknowledged gap that Agile is trying to create, trying to fulfill. So Agile is about discovering the value that we believe is out there, but we can't yet fully expect it because we don't know for certain. And it requires a little bit of faith to believe in the unproven. This translates into having a bit of faith in the people entrusted with creating it and in the process that they're going to use to create the unknown. Because ultimately it is the people who deliver the unknown. And this is a wide step away from many of the what traditional systems and processes have tried to create and come up with. So Agile thinking fundamentally begins within the individuals themselves. To embrace the experiment, to embrace the new, to embrace the unknown. But to do so with structure, to do so with alignment, with purpose, and with vision. And hopefully, in a few weeks from now, you'll all have that internal change enough to make some of this all a little bit easier. And that's our goal over the next few weeks. So let me encourage any of you who haven't yet thrown your questions up to do so. We have got a few minutes left and we'll be grabbing any questions that we have. Let me just have a look and see if we found any new ones that have come up. We look to have a couple here that I'll just mention now to get it going. So we've got a question here from William, I think, saying Agile development would need to be quite different from traditional contracts. How does an Agile contract work? It does work very differently. William, it does certainly cover very different things, because what's the point of a contract? Typically, it is the mitigation of risk, or rather the clarification of the assignment of risk. That's the reason why we write things down assignment, because we want to know who is taking the risk for the mistake. That's the core purpose of most contracts in this regard. So let's go back a step and redefine what we're talking about as what is the risk and what is the mistake. And then how does an appropriate contract deal with that? Well, if in the example that we talked about before, we're saying, well, you know, the price is fixed and the deadline is fixed, but the variable is what we're going to get out of it, then clearly you're going to have a contract that says this is fixed and this is fixed, but this isn't. It's going to be very different from a contract that says, well, you're going to build a bridge and it's going to be 4 lanes and it's going to support these kind of trucks. And that's inarguable. I mean, that's obviously a very different kind of contract. Agile contracts, yes, they work very differently, and they have to work from the position of defining and accepting a definition of 2 things. Firstly, that the exact definition of the outcome is sufficiently variable that we can still meet the contract even though we've delivered something a little bit different from what everyone thought we were going to deliver, but we can still meet the contract because we have in the contract stipulated an appropriate process for making sure at suitably regular intervals that we are incrementally building value that is incrementally acceptable to the person paying at the other end. So it's not a case of saying, well, you built that bridge yet? Let me check. Yep, 4 lanes each way, looks strong. All right, good, here's your money. Now, what we're saying is that every step along the way, we're checking for value and we're checking for acceptance. And we're granting the opportunity to the client, this amazing, invaluable opportunity that says, you know what, you can change your mind. You want add another lane, stick a train on the side? We can do that. Actually, probably not a good example with a bridge. We don't tend to do those sorts of things with bridges. Let's go back to the software example. You want to add another set of features? You want to make it available on a different operating system? You want to do something else like that? We can do that. There's always an opportunity cost. Let's talk about what's going to get taken off the project. Well, we can always talk about increasing the budget, but you know, we'd start with the assumption that we're not going to talk about that first, at least. Maybe we never talk about that because there's no chance of an increased budget. Maybe there is. This is the differences that go into this contract. The contract is covering how we're going to go about making sure value is delivered and is acceptable to the client incrementally rather than all at the end. Peter's asking a question here. I've heard that Scrum subset of the Agile philosophy has references to rugby union. Something's just resequenced to rugby union games. So can you comment on these, passing behind the forwards in Scrum? Yes, there is an origin that says it does come from rugby union. The idea of a Scrum, for those of you who are familiar with rugby union, Scrum conceptually is two things. It is a aggregation of resources. Everyone comes together, or part of the team comes together. Everyone gets into their set position. So a Scrum is a set piece. It's a point in time where everyone stands in the right spot and performs as part of a team, and we reassess which way the game is going to go. And out of that Scrum, after that Scrum, things happen that can take the game in a vastly different direction. Who's going to win the Scrum? Where's the ball going to go? Are you going to make a set play, or is it all going to go horribly wrong? It's a pause and review and opportunity to change direction. So from a conceptual point of view, there are perceived parallels, and this is part of the reason why I think the name Scrum was thrown in and where it's come from. And this is where these parallels, the parallels, you can philosophically dig and find a few more potential parallels. But yes, that is where the idea came from. And similarly, when you think about lean and the phrase that was originally coined by lean, it is all about making a manufacturing process more lean than it was. Perhaps a slightly easier parallel to draw from that point of view. So Edmund's saying, well, Scrum yields more value but takes longer for the project to complete compared to Lean, where it's faster to complete but yield less value in the end. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a consistent assessment. Looking at each point separately, I mean, would Scrum necessarily give you more but take longer? Well, not necessarily. You might have a Scrum deadline that said, well, we're going to finish by this deadline, and therefore we might get less than we expected because we've made the deadline sacrosanct. We've basically said, well, we're not going past this date. We're going to do our best to deliver the most effective thing of our project by that deadline, but we're not going to move it. And so our Scrum gets broken down in a chronological pattern that makes that deadline meaningful, and as we work through our iterations, we are clearer and clearer on exactly what we need to do to deliver a useful value by the end of it. So you could apply the reverse, potentially, from that point of view. So I wouldn't say, again, I think that's an example of an unfair comparison where we're saying, well, assuming this happens here, can we assume that happens there? Both can happen in both different types of methodologies. Lean certainly is something where you associate it with being fast. Lean is a sort of methodology that and again, because Scrum is an additive process of iterations and you build upon and you build upon and you build upon, Lean can be faster to implement because it's about taking things away. So yes, it can be quicker to implement as a philosophy perhaps. Doesn't necessarily mean it yields less value in the end because it really depends on exactly what your objectives are. So another question, how do you deal with constraints and or dependencies in Agile? Well, you do have, look at dependencies first, you do have planning about large-scale and small-scale sequencing. So it's not about saying, well, you know, let's just pick whatever, let's just throw a dart at the board and we're going to work on that first because that sounds interesting. I like the sound of that. Let's just work on that. Well, hang on. Maybe this other thing needs to be done first. So, all right, you're not going to necessarily start building a user interface before you start building a database architecture. So, you know, in the software project example, you do have dependencies. You have things that have to happen. A has to happen before B. These fundamentals are going to strategically influence the sequencing or the large-scale chronological planning and scheduling that you put into things. So we've talked about iterations, and you might turn around and say, well, look, these things are dependencies for other things. So we're going to look at those in the early iterations, and we're going to work on those in the early part because we're going to need to. So constraints, when you say, well, you know, these are the limitations that we have, we've kind of touched on that a little bit where we talked about you can have control variables and say, well, you know, we have to build it within these criteria. It has to be this. If you're going to build software for the finance industry, you're going to have some constraints surrounding security, clearly. So this is going to be something that works into something called practices. Now, practices are something that we will deal with in a little more detail when we talk about next week, but there are practices that are different from processes, and a practice is basically a standard. It's a way of saying, well, you know, we're going to make sure that we do everything. For example, you might have a testing practice. How do we test? Well, you know, we test at the time, we test as we go, we test with a buddy system, we test at the end of the week. There'll be different options and ways about it, and it's going to depend upon what and how you're doing it. That's going to influence what practices you implement for how that works. And some of your constraints that you might be looking at in a traditional project will translate into or will require appropriate practices in order to make sure that you tick that box. Question from Matthew, is the documentation usually associated with projects very different from Agile? I would say yes, it is usually quite different. Plan-based methodologies, you're probably familiar with the large-scale planning that goes on, and it can sometimes be phenomenally huge. You know, large-scale project can have a great deal of planning. And look, don't think at any point that I'm saying that that's a bad thing. There are some projects where that is 100% entirely appropriate and essential to accomplish. And you need that massive kind of planning. And that document looks vastly different in an Agile plan. But that doesn't mean you don't have any planning up front. It doesn't mean you've got no idea. It doesn't mean you start with nothing. You start with a clear vision. And we're going to talk about some examples in the next week. We'll talk a bit about Scrum. What might you have in terms of documentation before you kick off a Scrum project? And it might only be a handful of pages to begin with. So it might actually be a relatively small level of initial documentation, because what happens is that it sets the broad boundaries and guidelines which you then interpret, and you fill in the necessary details as you learn them, and you build your plan somewhat as you go. But you must start with the structure, the framework of your plan, which is based on the ultimate end game, the definition of the value that you're trying to create. Tim's asking the question, do you still use software like Microsoft Project for Agile projects? Well, the short answer is, do you use software? Absolutely. It is every bit as essential when you're tracking large teams of large amounts of work. But you might not use MS Project as an example. You would, I mean, there are a growing list of alternatives out there. And, you know, the interesting thing about this is that as much as I've sort of been belaboring the point tonight that there are very many different ways of going about implementing Agile methodologies, this kind of makes it tricky to find the right bit of software that's either a perfect fit for your chosen conglomeration of methods, or it can be sufficiently flexible and variable that you can cobble something together. I mean, years ago when I was involved hands-on in early 2000s in delivering IT projects, I had a team of project managers, and you know, we literally built our own project management system and workflow tool from the ground up, and we did it out of a business intelligence software that just had sufficiently a large enough number of customizable fields because there was nothing off the shelf that could do the job for us. And you know, this is a problem that has been slowly eroding as more and more enterprises come out with more and more interesting and flexible. But sometimes, you know, you can say that the decision of exactly what bits of methodology you're going to use might even be driven by the choices of acceptable software out there. And I have seen that happen. And that can sometimes be a good thing because it can make the whole process much simpler for people that find it a tad daunting to figure it all out. But it can also mean that you can end up getting wedded to a process or a software that isn't necessarily ideal. But, you know, we did that modification stuff in-house. It can be an expensive thing to do for large organizations to customize software to do that. But so yes, there's definitely software. You're going to need to use software. It's not as simplistic because of its variable nature. It's not as simplistic as project management software used to be. But there are some good options out there. Question from Alpha saying, will Agile work in organizations such as military, pharmaceutical, where rules are very strict? Yes and no. If you think about the process military, for example, the R&D process, the R&D project, we're going to build a new missile that does what? Well, it's going to fly here and go this fast and blow up this kind of stuff. Well, how do we do that? Well, that's probably an Agile project. So now we've got the design for this, and we've designed it and we've built it, and here's the blueprints, and now we need a process to manufacture 5 million of them. That's probably less Agile. but it might be a lot more lean in nature. So it really does depend, again, on all those circumstances. Could it be used for pharmaceutical? Well, again, if you're talking about the example we just used before, if you're talking about building software for the pharmaceutical, again, you're going to have some particularly unbreakable rules with regards to how that software might handle sensitive information, for example, and the accessibility of that. So you're going to have possibly some very strict practices, there's that word again, practices that might need to be adhered to, and that might need to be core fundamental requirements of how things get done. But what gets done is still going to be a little bit variable, might still be different. What features does your pharmaceutical software or pharmaceutical project actually have? What value does it yield in the end? It might still be something that you work at, but by Jesus, it's going to be secure. No matter what you do, it's going to be secure. That can definitely work in an Agile scenario. James, what else we got?
Hey, Brenton. We've got a few more good questions here, but we've hit the hour-and-a-half mark, and seeing as it's the first week, I thought we might say try to wrap it up here and suggest that anyone who's got a question that hasn't been answered now, and if you'd really like to get a discussion going on it, if people would like to take them to the discussion forum at learn.itmasters.edu.au, it'd be really great to see some big discussions start up on some of these really good questions, especially then everyone can really interact on them.
Yes, it's an excellent plan. I mean, I think that with the number of people we've got involved, there's going to be a wealth of knowledge out there far beyond mine and experience and insight that people can add to each other's perspectives that I think would be great to see happening. So we want to encourage that. What I will promise, though, that once we get to sort of week 2, week 3, if we've accumulated a list of unanswered questions, as I mentioned before, I will put together a recording of the questions getting answered as best we can, and that'll be something that you can download and listen to for anyone who's had those questions. It was pretty useful last time when we did this. It was well received, so happy to do that again at some point, perhaps after week 3, once we've got enough, if we have some unanswered questions along the way. But in the meantime, by all means, throw them up on the forums. Just a summary of things to do and think about at the end of this. Do check out the online portal if you haven't already. If you have, look out there. There'll be new pre-recorded audio early next week that'll be uploaded that you'll be able to grab, download, listen to, and keep you moving along with it. As we just mentioned, do tune into the forums. Even if you don't have any questions yourself, you may have something useful to add, something that someone else has asked. So I would encourage you to do that. Do listen to the recordings. I mean, this is something not just to bounce off. This is something that hopefully many of you will want to learn. Some of you will want to listen to these things more than once. Obviously, that's okay. And do come back next week, because we'll be here and we're going to go into detail about Scrum, which I'm hoping many will find quite interesting and exciting. So we will wrap up at that point. Thanks very much for everyone for tuning in. Great to see you all here. Looking forward to chatting with you all again next week. Do download the recording. Until then, next week, thanks very much and good night for now.